Humanity had spent centuries fighting wars, adapting, and evolving. When the stars opened to them, they didn't expand recklessly. They fortified. At the edge of known space, where empires clashed and civilizations fell, humanity built something unprecedented: Fortress Bastion. A structure so advanced, so impenetrable, that no invading force had ever breached its walls. To outsiders, it was arrogance. To humanity, it was necessity. The Zorvith Empire, warlords of 1,000 conquered worlds, saw it as a direct challenge. Warlord Kraxen had crushed entire species beneath his fleet. He did not believe in impenetrable defenses. He believed in overwhelming force. And so, the Zorvith sent their armada, a force so vast it blotted out the stars. Tens of thousands of warships, planetary siege cannons, and bioengineered shock troops bred for a single purpose: breaking humanity's so-called indestructible fortress. The first shots fired were planetary-scale bombardments. Energy lances capable of slicing moons in half struck the fortress's outer layer. The impact lit up space like a supernova, a spectacle of destruction. But when the energy cleared, Bastion remained. Its walls shimmered, the damage redirected, absorbed, repurposed. The Zorvith bombarded it for days, launching kinetic slugs the size of mountains. The fortress didn't flinch. Kraxen watched from his command throne, mandibles tightening. Increase bombardment. Deploy ground forces. Tear it down piece by piece. The Zorvith landed their war beasts, armored siege crawlers that had leveled continents. Their legions surged forward, expecting resistance. None came. The silence was worse than battle. The fortress remained dormant, as if humanity wasn't even trying to fight back. It unsettled the invaders. The fortress walls weren't just resisting, they were watching. Scanners mapped every Zorvith movement, calculating trajectories, predicting weaknesses. It was not a fortress. It was a predator. The first signs of something wrong came subtly. Zorvith ships in orbit reported energy fluctuations. Shields flickered. Communication lines crackled with interference. The fortress hadn't fired a single shot, yet their systems were failing. Kraxen's advisors hesitated. Something is interfering with our networks. Then shut it down. Kraxen barked. But the fortress had already gotten inside. The walls of Bastion weren't solid. They weren't even truly physical. The structure was a shifting lattice of nanite-infused material, adaptive and alive in ways no alien species had ever encountered. The fortress learned, adjusted, countered. When the Zorvith forces finally breached an outer segment, expecting to storm inside, they found nothing but empty corridors. Then the walls melted. Not from heat, not from attack, but by design. The architecture reshaped itself, swallowing entire battalions. Hallways extended endlessly, soldiers running in circles, lost in a labyrinth that had no exit. Panic set in. Zorvith commanders barked conflicting orders, their comms scrambled. Kraxen slammed a fist onto his throne. We are the Zorvith. No fortress stands against us. Advance. The fortress whispered back. A transmission came through, spoken in perfect Zorvith dialect.
Calm.
Almost amused. You call this an invasion? We've seen worse simulations. Kraxen's blood ran cold. This wasn't defiance. It was mockery. The Zorvith pushed harder, throwing wave after wave against Bastion's walls. Plasma cannons, siege drills, subatomic disruptors. Every weapon in their arsenal. And the fortress absorbed it all. The attacks weren't damaging it. They were fueling it. Then the walls melted again, but this time, they reformed into something else. Weapons. The fortress itself became an offensive force, turning the invaders' firepower against them. The first counterstrike was subtle. Ships in orbit began shutting down, their reactors inexplicably failing. Entire battalions lost contact with each other. Some Zorvith soldiers turned their weapons on their own, confused, hallucinating. The fortress wasn't just attacking physically. It was waging psychological warfare. Kraxen was no fool. He had conquered hundreds of worlds. But he had never faced an enemy who let him attack, let him expend his strength, only to turn it back on him. "Pull back," he growled. "Regroup. We find another way." But as he issued the command, his fleet's engines failed. One by one, Zorvith warships hung dead in space. Gravity wells formed where there had been none. The fortress hadn't just lured them in. It had trapped them. The realization struck like a death blow. The battle had never been about breaking through Bastion's walls. The battle had been over before it started. And humanity had already won. The walls did not break. They shifted. The fortress did not fall. It adapted. Kraxen watched in disbelief as the battlefield turned against him. His warships, his ground forces, his entire invasion, all unraveling like a poorly laid trap. The fortress wasn't just a defense, it was a weapon. A living, evolving entity built to counter everything the Zorvith could throw at it. His soldiers fought against shadows. Hallways twisted, expanding and collapsing like veins in a living organism. Squads were cut off, sealed inside shifting corridors with no exits. Some fired wildly at the walls, only to watch their own plasma bolts get absorbed and redirected. The walls did not just melt. They consumed. Zorvith command units reported anomalies. Their war machines, unstoppable in every other conflict, stood frozen, systems locked. When engineers attempted to reboot them, the machines turned on their own soldiers. Plasma turrets rotated mid-battle, tearing through Zorvith ranks. Siege crawlers crushed their own infantry. The fortress was speaking to them now, but not through words. It spoke through cold, calculated control. Every piece of Zorvith technology had already been compromised. Every weapon they brought to destroy Bastion had already been turned against them. And then humanity made its first real move. It began with the fleet. Kraxen's capital ships, still orbiting, suddenly detected gravitational shifts. Space itself seemed to bend. The fleet's formation shattered as unseen forces disrupted their positions. The engines of their largest warships roared against invisible constraints. But the more power they pushed, the more their systems collapsed. Entire battleships flickered out of existence, dragged into artificial gravity wells. Massive Zorvith carriers, capable of launching planetary sieges, imploded as their own energy cores overloaded. Kraxen had seen planetary warfare. He had seen civilizations burn. But this was something different. This was humanity showing its hand, and it was terrifying. He bared his fangs, mandibles clicking in fury. This is a trick, a deception. We are stronger than them. But his warships were not responding. His ground forces were scattered. And then came the message. Not a boast. Not a demand for surrender. A statement. This war was over before it began. Kraxen's blood ran cold. He had underestimated them. Not their walls, not their weapons, but their strategy. Humanity hadn't built an impenetrable fortress. They had built a perfect trap. The walls shifted again, this time with purpose. From their structure, new forms emerged, weapons unlike anything the Zorvith had encountered. Energy lances that bent space around them. Arc cannons that didn't fire projectiles but rather disassembled enemy ships at the molecular level. The fortress had never been meant to hold. It had been meant to counter. Zorvith commanders screamed for retreat, but there was nowhere to run. Their fleet, crippled from within, could not jump away. Their ground forces, stranded in the fortress's endless corridors, had no exit. Even those who tried to surrender found their weapons disabled, their armor locking up. And then the final blow fell. From deep within the fortress, an artificial intelligence, vast, omniscient, completed its calculations. It had learned everything it needed to. Zorvith command codes. Weak points. The vulnerabilities of an empire that had never lost. Humanity did not fire a final shot. They simply let the Zorvith destroy themselves. Kraxen watched as his own ships turned on each other, as their targeting systems failed, as their engines burned out. He had fought wars across the stars. But this was not war. This was dissection. He had been played from the beginning. The fortress was never a fortress. It was a lesson. And Kraxen was its final student. The silence was worse than the battle. Kraxen stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching as his empire's greatest armada collapsed. His warships, once the pride of the Zorvith, were reduced to floating wreckage. His armies, bred for conquest, were scattered, leaderless, and lost inside a fortress that refused to obey the rules of war. Retreat was impossible. Communications were severed. The ships that still functioned were trapped, unable to break free from the invisible force holding them in place. Some captains attempted emergency jumps, their vessels flickering for a fraction of a second before violently tearing apart. Whatever the humans had deployed, it didn't just block their escape, it rewrote the very fabric of space around them. The Zorvith were no longer an invading force. They were prisoners. Kraxen clenched his mandibles, trying to suppress the fury boiling inside him. Every instinct told him to fight, to burn this fortress down no matter the cost. But deep down, he knew the truth. Humanity had done something no species had ever dared. They hadn't just outmatched the Zorvith in firepower. They had outthought them. A transmission came through the static. Not from his fleet, but from the fortress itself. It was not a demand for surrender. No ultimatum. No request. Just data. Zorvith fleet schematics. Tactics. Weak points. The kind of intelligence that only deep infiltration could uncover. Humanity hadn't just learned how to defeat the Zorvith. They had understood them on a level no enemy ever had. A cold realization settled over Kraxen. This battle had never been about Fortress Bastion. It had been about proving a point. The fortress had let them in. Let them strike with all their might. Not to test its strength, but to learn. And now that it had learned, it no longer needed to fight. One by one, the remaining Zorvith ships began losing power. Not from an attack. Not from a weapon. The fortress had integrated itself into their systems. Every ship's core, every command relay, every targeting sensor, all compromised. It had been happening since the first shot was fired. Humanity had not just anticipated their strategy. They had taken control of it. Kraxen's claws dug into the armrests of his throne. He had led invasions against civilizations who thought they could resist. He had shattered entire fleets, crushed planetary defenses, broken wills. But here, in this moment, he felt something unfamiliar. Helplessness. The Zorvith were not losing this battle. They had already lost. The final act was not destruction. It was erasure. The fortress did not fire a single finishing shot. It did not need to. Instead, one by one, the Zorvith ships began to vanish. Not destroyed. Not consumed by explosions. Simply gone. Kraxen's scanners failed to explain it. One moment his warships were there, the next they were nothing. No wreckage. No energy signatures. Just empty space where mighty vessels once stood. And then he understood. The fortress wasn't just dismantling their fleet. It was removing them from existence. Kraxen had heard of weapons that could erase matter at a molecular level. But this was different. There was no violence, no devastation. The Zorvith were being unmade, as if they had never been. He tried to reach his commanders, but there was no response. His own crew stared at him, waiting for orders. Waiting for something. There was nothing left to order. The Zorvith were warriors. Conquerors. But against an enemy that did not simply destroy, but rewrote the very nature of warfare, they had no answers. Kraxen took one last look at Fortress Bastion, its walls shifting, its presence looming. Then his ship's lights flickered. The air grew still. The bridge crew froze, eyes widening in horror. And the flagship of the Zorvith Empire was no more. The Zorvith Armada no longer existed. There was no wreckage, no debris field, no aftermath of a hard-fought battle. The invincible war fleet, feared across 1,000 conquered worlds, had simply ceased to be. The fortress had unmade them, stripped them from reality with a precision that defied understanding. And now there was only silence. Across the galaxy, empires watched in stunned disbelief. The Zorvith had never lost. They had never even faced a true challenge. Their war doctrine was simple: overwhelm, dominate, consume. It had worked against every species they had encountered. Until now, humanity had not just repelled them. Humanity had erased them. Rumors spread like wildfire. Whispers of a fortress that could not fall, of walls that melted and reformed at will, of an intelligence lurking within that could unravel entire civilizations with a single calculated response. It was no longer just a structure. It was a message. For centuries, humanity had been underestimated. They were seen as young, fragile, untested in the grand conflicts of the cosmos. The Zorvith had believed the same. They had thought of Fortress Bastion as a mere obstacle, a delay in their inevitable conquest. And that was their greatest mistake. Because humanity did not build their defenses out of fear. They built them out of understanding. They had seen the rise and fall of empires. They had studied the mistakes of those who had come before. And they had learned the most important lesson of all: true strength is not measured by the wars you win. It is measured by the wars you never have to fight. The message spread, not through threats, not through conquest, but through undeniable reality. A simple transmission, broadcast across every known frequency. The walls did not break. They never had to, and the galaxy understood. The age of conquest was over. The galaxy did not know how to react. Empires that had stood for millennia, warlords who had raised civilizations, species that had believed themselves untouchable, all were silent. The Zorvith had been a force of nature, a relentless tide of conquest that none had ever stopped. Until now. Until Fortress Bastion. But humanity did not celebrate. There were no grand proclamations, no demands for submission. The fortress remained unchanged, its shifting walls standing as an unspoken warning. The lesson had been delivered. Across the void, rulers and strategists scrambled for answers. How had it happened? How had the Zorvith, the most feared empire in the known universe, been defeated without a single human casualty? How had their mighty fleet, their war-hardened generals, their unbreakable siege tactics, all been reduced to nothing? Speculation ran wild. Theories of advanced weaponry beyond comprehension. Whispers of an intelligence so vast it could rewrite reality itself. Some believed the fortress was not built by humans at all, but something older, something far beyond mortal understanding. But the truth was simpler, more terrifying. Humanity had not relied on a superweapon. They had relied on something far more powerful: strategy. The war had ended before it began, not because of superior firepower, but because the Zorvith had walked into a war they did not understand. They had expected brute force to win the day. They had expected a fortress that could be broken, that could be overwhelmed by sheer numbers. They had not expected a trap that had been centuries in the making. Fortress Bastion was not just a defensive structure. It was a battlefield designed to fight wars before they even started. Every wall, every corridor, every system had been built to counter threats before they could escalate. It did not resist invasion, it consumed it. It did not fight battles, it ended them. And it had done exactly that. The other empires watched, waiting for humanity's next move. Would they expand, now that the Zorvith were gone? Would they impose their will upon the galaxy, demand fealty, carve out an empire of their own? But no fleets emerged from Fortress Bastion. No armies marched into Zorvith space. Humanity simply waited. That was what unsettled them the most. The Zorvith had ruled through fear, through overwhelming force. Humanity ruled through patience, through inevitability. The message was clear. If you struck at humanity, if you threatened their existence, you would not be met with war. You would simply cease to be. And so, the galaxy changed. Not through conquest, not through destruction, but through understanding. Because there are wars that end with victory, and there are wars that end with silence.